Good morning. Time now 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, April 2nd, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group morning seminar organized by the World Bank Group Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I'm Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize many interesting seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time almost every week in the last 3 years, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. Every spring and autumn, each of the 6 regional chief economist offices of the World Bank would issue regional economic update report. It's April already, and we have reached to the spring semester of these regional economic updates. We will begin with East Asia and the Pacific region in our regional economic update series. Connecting from Washington, we have Egis Islamaj, Senior Economist in the Office of the Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific region. Good morning, Egis. How are you? Good evening to you in Washington.
Good morning to you, Koichi, and to everyone connected. Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Thank you very much. Egis presented in the previous 2 the EAP Regional Economic Update report last year. We are pleased to have him back in our seminar series. We'll listen to Egis presenting the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. As usual, we already received some questions from the viewers in advance, and thank you very much for sending those questions to us. Please keep sending your question even during the seminar. I'll read your questions asking Egis to respond after his presentation. With that, I would like to formally invite Egis to come in and then start your presentation. Egis, over to you.
Okay, Koichi, can you see the slides?
Yes, perfectly.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's such an honor to. This is the first time we present outside of our group in the bank, and I'm very happy to present because it's becoming a tradition. So this is the 3rd update that we have devoted to analyzing the effects of COVID-19 on the region's economies, and all 3 of them I'm presenting them to this audience. So as in the last updates, we cover a lot of ground, and I encourage everybody to look at the actual report if you haven't done so already. But for the purposes of today's event, I will highlight only a few main developments, prospects, and policy areas that we believe are important to support the recovery. So basically in this presentation, I'm going to discuss what is happening in the region. So this is a regional update. So we want to give a snapshot of what has been happening in the region recently. Because we are the Chief Economist Office and we spend a lot of time doing analytical work to try to understand why things are happening. I'm going to tell you what we think are the reasons behind what has been happening, rather than just in mere reporting. And then we're going to discuss some policy areas which fall under the category of what can be done. So basically, starting with what is happening. We argue that there's been a 3-speed recovery. First, the first group of countries are China and Vietnam. They were less scarred by the crisis. They were able to rebound quickly. I'm not going to talk about the extent of the crisis in these countries because that's what we did in the last 2 updates. But it's become obvious that they rebounded quickly. They were less scarred by the crisis than other economies in the region. And their output level in 2020 already surpassed the pre-COVID level of output. So the chart that you see here shows the actual and projected level of output by quarter, only that we have indexed the output level to the pre-pandemic level, which corresponds to the 4th quarter of 2019. And as you see, not only both China and Vietnam have been able to rebound and recover quickly, but through the course of 2021 and 2022, they'll continue to grow strongly. In the second group are mostly all the other large economies of the region, also some other smaller economy and Pacific Islands. In that group of economies, we say that there's been a rebound but not recovery. So this group of countries actually has been scarred by the crisis. And we noticed 2 things. First, the rebound is more sluggish. So the output is not yet to the pre-COVID levels. And also going forward, growth is supposed to be protracted, quite sluggish. Nevertheless, we believe that, for this group of countries, and here I'm showing a few representative ones, output will reach pre-COVID levels over the course of 2021, and in some cases over the course of 2022. In the third group, we noticed that there are some mainly small island economies that were hit quite a bit by this COVID recession. This corresponded with other natural disasters and other things going on in these economies. But what is interesting here is that in these economies, they were not affected as much by the disease, but they were affected by the shutdown with the rest of the world, mainly from lack of tourism. So in the foreseeable future, we usually try to forecast the next 2-3 years. We don't see the output in these economies reaching the pre-pandemic levels. So we say that there's been neither a rebound nor a recovery for these economies. So due to the economic distress that I just described, poverty in the region stopped declining for the first time in 2 decades during the course of 2020. So basically the yellow line that you see here is the pre-COVID baseline of the number of poor people as measured by the $5.5 per day poverty line. And so this is what would have happened if COVID had not happened, according to the projections of the World Bank. And the red line is actually what happened with COVID involved. So again, you saw quite a bit of variation amongst countries. So when we say poverty stopped declining and you see the straight line here, it doesn't mean that poverty did not increase in some countries. Like China and Vietnam saw positive growth even during the course of 2020. So poverty in aggregate in those countries actually decreased because growth was positive, so it was almost by definition. But in almost all the other regions' economies that saw negative growth, poverty has actually declined. So we estimated that 32 million people, basically is the difference between the yellow and the red line, were prevented from escaping poverty. At the same time, as poverty increased, COVID accentuated inequalities in the region. And this happened because of the disease and the resulting shutdowns, and also unequal access that the poor had to social support in many countries. And as always, the depletion of physical and human capital is always more dire among the poor. So in some countries, children of households in the bottom 2/3 of the income distribution are as much as 20 percentage points less likely to be engaged in learning than children on the top 1/5. So basically, this is the chart that you are seeing on the slide, and it is showing the students, so the share of households with enrolled students that were engaged in say online, mobile, or face-to-face learning activities. And again, so this pandemic was unequal for many people in the region, and especially the poor could not benefit or were left behind from having to access learning through online tools. We don't go into details why. Is it a lack of access to the internet or other reasons? But generally this was the case, and this is one reason why inequality would increase going forward. Something we argue in this report is that women are also disproportionately affected. This is like a proxy, what we show here. So it's the idea that women during the pandemic, they've been suffering more violence. And again, in both of these charts, and in the chart that I'm going to show next, this data comes from high frequency World Bank surveys that they started right as COVID-19 hit in the region. And they did several rounds of these surveys in different contexts. These are phone surveys, but the World Bank has been working hard to try to get real-time information to the best of its abilities. So violence towards women increased, and we know that food insecurity makes women more vulnerable to violence, whether economic empowerment makes them less so. So the fact that we see an increase in violence towards women means that either they were suffering food insecurity, or they were suffering less economic empowerment, and therefore we conjecture that that's why that's what we relate to this increase in violence to. There's also now it was a big shock, major shock, as we've been arguing in the last two updates. So everybody was hit, but again, the smaller firm, for example, and the poor were hit the hardest. So again, going back to these business pulse surveys, these high frequency surveys that the World Bank has been conducting during these times, the sales, we find that the sales of the micro firms and then small, medium enterprises are actually, the loss in sales is actually larger than the loss in sales of large firms. So again, with this inequality in mind, we wanted to think and put together a framework about what's going to happen going forward. But before doing that, we want to spend a little time explaining why. Why do we think that the COVID hit the region as it did, as hard as it did first? And then second, what explains the differences across countries, right? In some countries, as we saw, China and Vietnam, they did better. And we already know, and I've argued in the past, that also they were able to recover faster from COVID-19. So they were less scarred from COVID-19. Whereas other countries, like Indonesia and the Philippines, had a particularly hard time. And then also Malaysia later started getting more COVID cases, but Thailand, did better in terms of infections, but they were their economy suffered quite a bit. And in the other extreme, you have the Pacific Islands that really have very low number of infections, and almost all the cases were imported cases. And they were able to basically quench them quickly, not let them spread around, but their economies are suffering so much. So we think that the better performing countries were able to contain COVID-19 efficiently by transitioning to early from stringent shutdown to effective test-based strategies, rather than relying on these prolonged lockdowns. Now, I guess the big question coming forward is, okay, what about the vaccines? So far, the rollout of the vaccines has not had an appreciable effect or an impact on growth in the region, but it doesn't mean that it will not have in the future. It just means that by the time that this update came out, the vaccine rollout in the region was just picking up steam. So it wasn't there taking effect yet. So going forward, we're going to see, hopefully the vaccines will benefit everybody in the region, but inefficiencies in the rollout of vaccines might derail growth going forward. The second reason is basically, as I mentioned, is the way the governments reacted. So in some cases, like in the Philippines, the shutdowns were really harsh and prolonged, and they were not able to really take under control the infections. But in other countries, Thailand, Vietnam, China at the beginning, after the beginning period, they reacted quickly with very effective strategies, and they were able to stop the disease. The other reason why some countries did better than others is that, some of them, they were able to take advantage from the revival of trade, and the countries that did better were not excessively dependent on tourism. Again, this is Thailand, Philippines, and the island economies. At the same time, we also find that countries that had better fiscal space were able to provide a more significant, a more efficient fiscal and monetary support, because their governments were in a better position and markets reacted with less panic, especially at the beginning of the crisis. So this is a nice framework that we put together just to keep our thoughts organized. But indeed, our team actually spent some time doing some analytical work, and we found that the lockdowns saved lives, right? But they hurt livelihoods. Right? So this was our first argument that if some countries chose, very strict and prolonged lockdowns, they hurt growth, as we know. But countries that were able to do better strategies like testing, tracing, and then making sure that they were targeting better, where they focus their lockdowns if necessary. They not only were able to do better, but we find in our analytical work that especially testing saves lives and saves livelihoods. So basically, it had a significant negative effect on the new infections, and it had actually a positive and significant effect on growth. Other factors that affect growth are tourism. So countries too dependent on tourism were more negatively affected. And countries that had higher debt levels, so they have lower fiscal space, also they were more likely to see lower growth during 2020, which is what these regressions are for. So several EAP countries were able to take advantage of the quick revival in trade, especially the electronics, which saw a resilient global demand. So one interesting thing that happened during this pandemic is that, well, first, the global value chains remained quite intact. So initially, there was some disruption in trade, which was very short and very temporary, just because of the nature of the disease and people were in contact, etc. But then very soon, the trading goods picked up and has been strong at the global level. It has been especially strong and resilient in goods like electronics. Why? Because consumers in advanced economies, and especially in the US and in Europe and even other countries, they continued purchasing more and more TV sets, bigger TV sets, and of course, upgrading their internets, their computers, they're working from home. And it so happened that the East Asian and Pacific countries, the East Asian countries that we study, they were very well positioned to take advantage of this opportunity that came. So we looked at the top 5 export baskets of the East Asian economies, and almost in every country's top 5 export basket, these goods like electronics and similar goods featured in that basket. So they were able to benefit from resilient global demand. And as we said, tourism dependence had negative outcomes on growth. So putting this all together, now we understand why, and then we saw how this pandemic not only had affected growth in 2020, but they had left scars in many countries, almost all countries. Then we tried to think next what's going to happen forward, and we discuss in our update that what has happened will constitute a shock to inclusive growth going forward. And this shock will be because public investment will be limited by lower fiscal space, because the deficits in all countries and debt in all countries has gone up. Private investment will also be inhibited because there still remains uncertainty due to COVID, due to the new variants, what's going to happen, and also the balance sheets of private companies have worsened during this crisis. So it is very likely, it is expected that there will be slower investment going forward, which will mean less capital to contribute to what we refer to as potential growth. Human capital will be eroded and already has been eroded. So as we've been discussing before, and as I mentioned, there have been sickness because some people lacked, or they that they got COVID, or they didn't have, because the hospitals were crowded, they didn't have the proper access to health care for other problems. There's been food insecurity. The surveys that I mentioned have been reporting an increase in food insecurity across many countries. Job losses, education closures, especially amongst the poor whose income are actually is going to suffer more. We estimate that the poor will, so not the poor, but generally due to COVID, due to losses in human capital, the lifetime earnings will decrease by 4%. So imagine, like every year for the rest of your life, people will be earning 4% less than they would have if COVID had not happened. Again, this is an average figure. Some students will be able to catch up with that, but many will not. And whatever happened during this time will leave scars. And at the same time, we believe that productivity will be hurt by firm closures, disruptions in firm worker relationships, less investments, that I argued before, means less research and development, less investment in research and development. And if there are disruptions in trade, they will also be reflected in lower pass-through of know-how and lower productivity. So all this together, we actually put them, try to go a little more analytical about it and try to think through the lens of a long-term neoclassical growth model. And our estimates were showing that the potential output growth in the region could be as much as 2 percentage points lower going forward. So first, even before COVID started, which is what this chart shows now, the baseline of potential growth, which is calculated as a function of capital, labor, human capital, and productivity. So even before COVID, it was growing slightly. This was due to aging in some countries, capital accumulation, so investment was already declining, in the last few years, and also, investment efficiency in a few countries, including in China and Indonesia, was getting slightly worse. So you see that there's like a slight drop along some of these dimensions, but then in the presence of COVID, this loss in potential output growth will be even more accentuated, and then we conjecture that in a low case scenario, when COVID basically continues lingering, these new variants compromise the effectiveness of vaccines, which means that a lot of countries will revert back to shutdowns, and things will get worse before they get better. Then potential growth could decline by as much as 2 percentage points over the next 10 years. A silver lining in all this is that COVID has actually jump-started or has led to an acceleration in technology adoption. A lot of firms across the region and across the world, actually, they started adopting more and more of these technologies. Now, most firms, mainly, or what these data show, is that the majority of firms have adopted technologies, even those that were not adopted before. But a lot of them are mainly focusing on e-commerce, basically online sales, and simple technologies like that. That in and itself, yes, it enables this firm to continue selling and not go bankrupt, but it's not necessarily a change in the production function that increases productivity going forward. Some firms also have been accelerated the adoption of some more sophisticated technologies, like for example, data analytics, and in some other cases, these management processes. But unfortunately, that's only a minority of firms. So it's basically the more established firms that were already, getting involved in this type of technologies, that somehow they accelerated them through COVID. So again, it's not all bad news. Overall, we think there will be a positive effect of this technology adoption due to all these firms getting more digital. But the increase in productivity will not be big enough to counteract the other negative effects of COVID, because, as I said, only a minority of firms are actually engaging in productivity enhancing technology changes, and most of them are merely trying to figure out changing sales from in person to online. So with this in mind, that there was already a big shock, we're not out of the woods yet. Going forward, things, structurally there will be some problems, but then looking at the risks over the near term, so basically looking ahead, in the update we tried to bring like a more positive tone than compared to the previous two updates. Basically, we said that the risks going forward are a little more balanced than before, and the reason for this, or one of the reasons for this, one reason is that countries are already recovering, so hopefully they are not where they were 6 months ago. But the very significant US stimulus is one reason why there is some room for optimism. So we saw the US enact all this stimulus very recently, and is being rolled out, and that will give a boost to the global recovery. The OECD had a report that actually put numbers on it, and the numbers were quite significant. And we, through some analytical work that was done at the World Bank with other colleagues from other groups, we estimate that these positive impacts of the US stimulus could add up to 1 percentage point on average to the growth of the region, in 2021, but also continuing in 2022. On the other hand, as I alluded to in the beginning, the region has just started to, work to implementing the vaccines. So a slow implementation of vaccinations or some new variant that somehow compromises the effectiveness of these vaccines could retard growth by as much as 1 percentage point in some countries, right? So again, this is if the countries we'll see again an increase in the number of new infections. If some of them may need to resort back to lockdowns or to constraints to mobility, and also the precautionary behavior of consumers, all will add up and retard growth in the country. So this was pretty much, as I said, like a succinct summary of what has happened, why, and what we think will happen going forward. Now, in the second part of the update, what we do is we look at a few policy areas where we focus in these 3 policy areas, and we try to discuss in detail how they can help support the recovery and also support a more resilient growth going forward. Now, again, the issues are big. We want to be clear that everything that we said or everything that has happened that I didn't say is important. And I invite you to look at the past update if you are looking for more information about schooling, for example, like what to do about it and what has been happening, or social protection, or about the smart containment, how countries that have done better have gone by containing the virus, and also how to support firms, households, financial sector policy, and trade reforms. For this current update, we focused on 3 policy dimensions. Again, not because we think the others are not important, but because we see these updates as a continuation of one another. And the first one is basically containing COVID through vaccination strategies. The second policy area is fiscal policy to support relief, recovery, and growth. And also climate change policies or climate policies to help countries build a more resilient recovery and growth going forward. So the policy dilemma number one is basically projected in the update as this race between infections and the vaccines. So we tried to look at looking at a lot of data. This is through many colleagues in and outside the bank. We look carefully at the vaccine purchases and also the contracts, the commitments to buy vaccines through the course of 2021 in all countries of the world. And already, even if you look at the picture, there is an inequality there, and we've seen in the news that all the mainly advanced economies, US, Europe, Canada, Australia, other countries, they have rushed to secure vaccines for their citizens, and then in the end come the developing countries. Some of them have the funding, some they don't have, and some of them can find supplies, some of them cannot find supplies. And then on top of that, if you think that these vaccines have different efficacies, so basically you see in the news, some of them, Pfizer and Moderna, are 90% or 94% effective. Some of them are 80% effective, and some of them are 50, 60% effective. So once you do an adjustment for this efficacy, you see this big inequality in vaccines, where you have some advanced economies that seem to be doing better and hoarding vaccines, and then you see some developing countries that are really lacking vaccines. So we estimate that with the current stocks and allocation of vaccines, the advanced economies would achieve at best about 80% coverage. So they would be able to have vaccinated about 80% of their population by the end of 2021, but developing countries only 55% of population. And this is like in the best case scenario. So note, if you try to connect this with what you've been reading about the vaccine, is that in many developing countries there won't be enough to basically reach herd immunity through vaccines. And this is not even counting for possible new variants that may come there. Another inequality that we noticed when discussing these things is when we put these charts together. So basically, the vaccines procurements around the world and the infection rates. And this is where it gets more interesting, right? Because it looks like vaccines are not going where the infections are the highest. And it's at least worth asking whether this is a good strategy. So whether it makes sense for each country to basically do their best and try to one by one vaccinate all its citizens, or whether it's best to think of a global cooperation where you focus rapidly, very fast, to the areas where the infections are highest and where the likelihood of new variants emerging is the highest. And this is what we, the position that we take in the update, that these inequalities cross on how the countries are affected and how the vaccines are procured around the world is something that hopefully nothing happens, but could lead to problems going forward, especially if these new variants become dangerous. We also did like a thought experiment and said, again, let's take all these vaccines, these extra vaccines that these advanced economies have accumulated, like you saw there, Canada and Australia, for example, and let's redistribute them equally to all the countries that have lack of vaccines. And again, even in the base case scenario, they will not reach the levels that are required for herd immunity. And in a more fancy way, this is what this chart on the right shows, that only in North America and in some European countries, the levels of R0, which is basically this measure that measures the reproduction of the disease, and we know if that is higher than 1, then the number of infections will keep growing. But if it's lower than 1, then it will come slowing down until it is eliminated. So this is something to think about. In terms of policies, I mentioned some of them, but to be a little more practical and to think more smartly about how the best strategy is. We are not suggesting that countries should not vaccinate, but try to redistribute. But they're probably a good way to make sure that these new variants are under control. So high infection countries, and this would include in our region, Indonesia and Philippines, probably they need to focus on vaccinations, because that's the only way that they'll be able to slow down the disease. But other countries that have been able to control COVID, maybe they have more space and time to think of better strategies about how to vaccinate people and how to do it in a way that they will minimize the probability of that virus coming back to them in another way and creating chaos again. At the same time, the chart that I showed you before, that even under the best case scenarios, it doesn't seem that in 2021 herd immunity will be reached in many parts of the world. This calls that even if the rollout of the vaccines is satisfactory in many countries and continues fast, still this should be implemented by MPIs, by non-pharmaceutical interventions, especially testing, tracing, and isolation, mask wearing, public information campaigns. The countries should not ease up on measures that they have done so far, especially the ones that are not hurtful to growth. And of course, the other thing is that countries should cooperate, and they should try to increase the production of vaccines and distribute according to need. And this is being done to some extent, but the needs are so big that they need to do more. So that was about policy dilemma number 1. In policy dilemma number 2, we argue that we need to provide, these countries need to provide fiscal support without undermining stability. So we try to basically look carefully at how countries spend their money during this crisis, how their fiscal support was allocated, and what does that mean? What did that mean during 2020 for relief, recovery, and growth in those countries? So we argue that first is the need for relief, and especially during those times when COVID hit and everybody had to stay home. For countries who did not have savings or could not work from home, then that meant their livelihood. So relief given to those countries is a lifeline for people and firms. And during this time, also, things are happening fast. You really don't have time to start to trying to pick, to target, to see, okay, who needs the money, who doesn't need the money. So in a lot of cases, we saw countries basically throwing money to everybody that they could, reach everybody that they could, and probably that was the best strategy. Now, as countries recovered, let's say second half of 2020, but of course it depends on how the infections hit in each country, but on average, then we start thinking about the recovery. So now this recovery phase, again, it's there's still a lot of what we refer to as deficient demand. So it's more like a Keynesian underemployment equilibrium, where basically the economy is recovering, but supply was already disrupted. Demand continues to be sluggish. So things are opening up, but we know that, some sectors are not opening up, like tourism is not going to come back, whatever they do. But we argue that during this recovery phase, there is still room for support, but this support to have greater effectiveness should be a little more targeted. For example, if you target in sectors on people in need, you can help them to preserve lifelines, and in return they're going to spend to give back to the economy. But also, you can invest in public works, and this. But again, you want money to come to the economy fast. So you want to do it through shovel-ready investment projects, or investment projects that were already planned, and you just want to accelerate them. And indeed, we saw some of these countries do exactly that. Then, as the countries continue they have rebounded and they continue to recover, then the long-term growth still calls for some support to help countries transition to a more inclusive and sustainable growth. And of course, this will depend on the fiscal space that these countries have, and this could be done through investment in infrastructures, through strengthening social support, and of course addressing climate externalities, which are quite problematic in the EAP region. So this was basically just the framework how to think about it, and indeed we saw that in the EAP countries, earning losses and support to households. So earning losses were quite high, and the relief that was given to households was less than earning losses. So yes, relief was given, it helped quite a bit, but there was still there's still room there, or there's still scars remaining, as we are calling them, that might necessitate some continued support. We estimate through the lens of this model that where we measure output gaps, we try to get some insights on what we refer to as a deficient demand. So the output gap reflects basically the distance from an estimated demand to the actual supply, and if that is negative, it means that these countries are under what we call the Keynesian underemployment, and further government support will not lead to an overheating of the economy. So, as is probably well known, we don't need a model to tell you that in 2021 in most countries output gaps were negative, but what we find is that in all of these countries, even in 2021, the output gaps will continue to be negative. In China and Vietnam, less so, and basically these models come with some caveats and with some confidence bands. So the standard errors are such that we cannot distinguish if they are different from zero or not. But again, in many of the region's economies, the further support is needed, and we believe that further support will not overheat the economy. And as I was discussing there, that as countries start to recover, they transition from relief to public investment. What we found is that only a few countries in the region have been able to activate public investment to help growth, where most countries have so far relied on relief. So going forward, the idea is that there is room. So whether the countries are now, or let's say the relief stage has passed, hopefully for most countries, but whether the countries are in the recovery phase or in the growth phase, there's an argument, and there is need for supportive fiscal policy. The question is, can the countries do it? So we try to ask the question, hey, what should be the fiscal consensus in this emerging markets more generally, but specifically in East Asian economies? So they have been very prudent, especially since their crisis more than 2 decades ago. And that has actually served them well. They have seen good and steady resilient growth. But can they continue to borrow, especially now that we see that interest rates are low globally, and it leads to a situation where R minus G, so interest rates are lower than the actual growth rate. So if interest rates are lower than the growth rate, arithmetically, this leads to a condition where if countries continue to borrow, so basically if they have deficits, if they need to have deficits, if those deficits are small enough, then they can continue to do that forever. And because growth will make up for those service payments that they have to do and for paying back for the debt that is being accumulated, we won't see that debt becoming unsustainable. This has become almost a mainstream thought or there's a lot of discussions in the advanced economies, and we thought it's only the least we could do is ask the question for emerging economies. Indeed, the differential between R and G in the East Asian economies, and this includes only the main emerging market economies, the ASEAN 5 plus China, has been negative. But we argue that this is not a license to keep borrowing. First, these R minus G are subject to reversals, as you see these points, these periods here that were rated above zero. And indeed, the probability of those reversals is higher when the debt is higher. And as debt increases, we see that that is associated with lower growth and with higher interest rates. So basically, if these countries keep borrowing, debt will increase, growth will increase, interest rates will decrease, R minus G is more likely to turn positive from negative. So it's not a good idea for them to continue borrowing. In addition, interest rates are actually positive and significant. They're not zero in these economies. So the service payments for them will also be considerable. It's not like zero like in advanced economies. So what we argue is that what can they do? I mean, it's not that they should stop borrowing, but they can start with better targeting. So we see that the targeting during this crisis, I mean, the help given to households and firms was admirable, but targeting could have been better. So, and again, it's okay because it was a relief stage, but as they go into the recovery stage, maybe they should think about the recovery. And indeed, empirical work, I mean, work done both by us and some of them by the IMF, shows that when the governments are able to target these transfers, then the returns to both output and consumptions are higher. So we argue that the countries should increase the efficiency of expenditures and investments, and they should credibly commit to future disciplines and efficiency enhancing reforms, because they should be mindful that borrowing cannot go on forever, even though R minus G is lower now. And the third point was about focusing on green growth. So we have to remember that this region, and mainly the biggest economies in the region, are now some of the biggest emitters in the world, and at the same time, is also the highest region at risk from climate change because of all the Pacific Islands, and because in also many other countries, bigger countries, there are many regions of the countries that are subject to climate change. Now, when they started spending, people have estimated the environmental impact of this fiscal spending. So when they started spending, we noticed that these new measures that were being introduced, this does not include only the developing EAP countries, but more broadly, they were more brown, we call them, than green. Now, again, these countries were focusing on restarting the economy, revitalizing growth, but going forward, they are spending, or they have to spend, they might as well spend green, help with their environment and their resilience to these shocks. And again, one thing that they can do is basically think about introducing carbon taxes and basically estimations. These are simulations. The simulations show that introducing some charges to carbon will basically help them achieve their climate goals, and those goals are already significant. So we discuss in detail, and we argue that these countries should phase out regressive fossil fuels and energy subsidies. They should try to focus more on stimulating green activities, and especially the ones that have higher multipliers. And they should also price carbon, as I said, recycle revenue, and foster investment in innovation and low carbon infrastructure. In all these three policy areas, and I think I spent more time than I should have, apologize for that, we argue that cooperation is essential. It's already clear, hopefully to everybody from my discussion, that cooperation on the production, approval, and allocation of medical goods, not just vaccines, but also, other medical goods that are needed on the support to fight COVID, will be more effective, will be better distributed or better targeted if there is cooperation among countries. There's cooperation needed in fiscal support. So we discussed that some countries might feel that if everybody is putting big stimulus like the US, and this will lead to a global recovery, maybe I can piggyback on that, but that will lead to basically countries in total to underspend. So now it's better if they focus on their own goals, what they need to do about the economy, and not try to basically benefit from other countries. And green growth, this is probably the most obvious. It should be coordinated climate action, because whatever one country does will affect not only the country, but the whole globe. And in all three areas, we argue that China is a main player, and it has a vital role in helping and facilitating. It should act, and it can act. It has the capability to help on all these fronts. So thank you very much. This was my my discussion for today. Hope you could follow, and again, apologies for going a little bit over time.
All right, thank you very much, Aegis, for your presentation about the report, which was just issued recently. We received the lots of questions actually, and let me read several questions. Then together ask you to respond, and then we wrap up the session. So first question from Mariama-san. Regarding the figure 1.30, which is, I think, the figure in the main report, richer students are more likely to remain engaged in learning activities. Do we have a chart that shows data by year? So it's a clarification question from Mariama-san on that. So that's one. Second question sent by anonymous participant. Thank you very much, actually sending a lot of questions. I'll read one of them. How do you think the accuracy of the information regarding the gender-based violence? Are there any characteristics of increasing gender-based violence during COVID-19 by each country? So this is a question from the anonymous participant. Let me continue reading other question from Sato-san. Thank you very much for your question. Slide 19 shows the Pacific Islands are almost left behind compared to other EAP countries. Given the pandemic, facing with limited physical space, disappearance of the tourism, what would be the key fundamental solutions for those countries to survive, and how would the World Bank support them? So the Pacific Islands questions. And then another question from Kodera-san. Thank you very much for your question. It is easy to talk about green recovery. Does the bank have specific medium-term energy policy for climate change in individual countries, for example, Indonesia? Thank you very much for your question. And then lastly, let me read a question from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation. Education, infrastructure, vaccination, etc. requires lots of money for many developing nations. World Bank assistance would be very much required. Would it be possible to issue the bond much more than usual by the World Bank to increase the assistance to the countries? For example, would the World Bank bond be issued 50% more than normal years? So I read five set of questions. Question on Mongolia, question on gender-based violence, question on Pacific countries, question on green recovery, climate change in Indonesia, and the World Bank bond. So I'll ask Elgis to come in to sort of comprehensively respond, and then we wrap up the seminar. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Koichi, and thank you very much for your questions. I think these are excellent questions. First, I want to maybe clarify a little bit. Maybe I wasn't very clear in the presentation that those charts about inequality. So what I mean in the past, or what we do other reports in the World Bank, then you try to look at the data over the years, what are the trends, what has been going. But because this shock was so different than anything else we had seen, so the crucial point is how to get in real time accurate information, right? So all the data, and I think I mentioned this during the presentation, comes from surveys, high frequency surveys, and several rounds of these surveys were done across countries in the world. Actually, the World Bank did, but we only showcase those in the East Asia and Pacific region, starting in April and May, and they continue in June, July, August, and later September, and they are continuing through the course of 2021. So these surveys were done for households, they were done for firms, and then there were separate surveys that were done for gender-based violence. So first, unfortunately, again, we do not have, there are other surveys, other information, data points that would show what has happened year by year, but these ones were basically just for the COVID situation, and we in some cases they exist for multiple rounds, but not going back on time. For the gender violence work, again, this is something that was done by our Gender Innovation Lab, which is part of our team, and this is done through phone surveys. Now it's a little tricky because you will likely not get good answers if you just call participants and ask them to tell you what has been happening. So you don't know who is listening on the other side of the phone, if they feel secure talking over the phone. So this is not like in other World Bank work for previous years when this was face-to-face. But they try to rely through these proxy measures. For example, they ask them, instead of asking, have you been subject to violence, they ask, oh, do you think the violence in the community has increased? And that's what we report, right? So this was number one and number two. Number three was about Pacific Islands. So that is very tricky. Some Pacific Islands, not all, they were really hit hard. We don't, so all the estimates that they don't expect a pickup in tourism until 2023, I believe, and this is what we remark this in the report, although that we don't really do an analysis of the tourism sector per se. And so which means that these Pacific Islands will not recover easily. Now, we also should keep in mind, as I said in the presentation, that other things have happened there too, like Fiji. The growth rate was minus 19%, I think in 2020, if I remember correctly, so close to 20%. But there were also 2 tropical storms that hit Fiji during 2020, in addition to COVID restrictions and 0 tourists. So these things that are happening, not only they affect growth, it's not about just restarting tourism, but is that in some cases these countries will really need help. we maybe emphasize more on the role that international financial institutions can play. But a lot of these countries are in high risk of debt distress, and they qualify for this being part of these initiatives that the international community has been putting forward. And again, this also takes me to the next question. Unfortunately, I'm not the right person because I'm not in a position to tell you how much the bank will spend or how much will support. But I would say that Koichi here is running a great seminar, a very timely one. And he made sure that not only we presented right after the report was out, but this presentation was made before the spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF, which start in the next week. So I think the World Bank president has already made some announcements about that, and through the course of the meetings, the World Bank and the IMF, they are increasing the funding, they're increasing the support for that is being given to these countries. That they're increasing the efforts to bring together the international community to help these countries. And I again encourage everybody to follow closely to the spring meetings, because it's a big event, it's a very important event, and the focus is all on vaccines, on debt, and then on green growth. I think there was also another question for whether the World Bank has targets for each country. So again, I wouldn't know the case for Indonesia. Yes, this is basically transitioning to green growth. It's something that the world is very close to the World Bank mission, and the World Bank cares about it a lot. And many countries or the World Bank teams in many countries are working closely with their governments to come up with different programs to integrate this green growth. This can take many forms. It can take the form of adaptation, especially in some of the smaller economies of the region, like Pacific Islands, right? We cannot fathom that, some small country in the region would make such a change in their carbon emission that will affect, take for example, like Fiji. I mean, Fiji, I don't know, I'm not saying anything about pollution that is in Fiji, but mechanically by its size, it will not change the global outcomes, even if they go 100% green. But other countries like China and Indonesia, they have the potential to change. Now, this is where international cooperation becomes important. In the report, we have the example of Vietnam, right? So Vietnam has this national optimal levels of greening that they have put, and that is the money that they have put together. Now, again, they will achieve something that it's preserves a nice balance between greening and growth, and many countries have indeed, with consultation from the World Bank, in many cases they have put forward the money to do that. But that targeted level, it's something very positive, it's something achievable for the countries, but that impact would be even greater if the World Bank or the international community put even more money into that, and that's what we are arguing in the report. Did I miss anything?
The final question on the World Bank bond.
Yeah, no, that's the thing that I said. I'm not in a position to give an answer to that, and I have no information, but follow the spring meetings closely. The World Bank it started very strongly in their spring meetings last April, when COVID hit. It continued in October, and basically everybody in the World Bank has been working with the same intensity over the course of this year. So they are very serious about helping countries and making sure the recovery from this shock is fast.
All right, thank you very much, Islamaj, the Elgis Islamaj. we have connected from Washington, D.C., the senior economist in the office of the chief economist for East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank. Ergi, thank you very much for your time to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Next week, we'll be introducing a new report jointly published by the World Bank and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, titled Global Cost for Inclusive Refugee Education, issued on February 25. This will start at 10 a.m., not at 8 a.m. on Friday, April 9th. And week following, we will be back in the spring semester to introduce the series of the regional economic update, starting with South Asia, that will try to cover all other regions during the rest of the April. So with that, I would like to thank you for viewing the seminar this morning. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you next week. Thank you very much.